Maria Elena talked about the current period of reforms in Chile today. And I am interested in reforms. I have always been interested in reforms. And my first interest in Chile came during a previous period of reforms in 1964, when I was a young graduate student at Berkeley, and the government of Chile engaged in an agrarian reform. Most of you students will only know of this as history. Some of you will remember that period of reformism. I was a young graduate student working on agrarian reforms in Italy at the time, and I was writing my dissertation. And like many graduate students, I was having difficulty putting my words on paper. And someone said, there is this country called Chile, in which there's also an agrarian reform. I was looking for excuses not to write my dissertation. And so I thought, I'll go to Chile, and I will do a comparative study of agrarian reforms in Chile and Italy. I spoke to my professor about this, and he said, Chile, it's very far from Italy, isn't it? I said, yes. I said, but it's also a Latin country, and I can manage to speak Spanish because I speak Italian, and they're having an agrarian reform. And he said, have you finished writing your dissertation? And I said, not yet. And he said, you may not go to Chile. And so my arrival has been a little bit delayed. And in the interim, Chile has gone from a period of reforms to a period of revolutionary change to a period of counter-revolutionary dictatorship. And now, once again, we are in a period of reform. So my arrival has been a little bit delayed, only by 50 years. But I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to be here during a period in which social conflict has led to reform, and hopefully will lead to greater cohesion. So today I'm going to talk about a new subject. It's a new subject for me, and I think it is largely a new subject for the social sciences. And that is the subject of the relationship between war and social movements. 2 decades ago, when my friend and collaborator Charles Tilly published his major work, Coercion, Capital, and European States, which was about war and state building, I had the bad grace to complain that the book ignored the subject he had practically invented, the subject of contentious politics. Tilly wrote about how war-making had led to state building, to taxation, to protection of the citizens, and ultimately to citizen rights in early modern Europe. But the book never dealt with contentious politics. How did he respond when I charged him with this sin of omission? I have written many books on contention, he joked. It's time I wrote about something else. When Tilly and I, together with Doug McAdam, a well-known sociologist in the United States, decided to write a book together called The Dynamics of Contention, we did not want to limit ourselves to social movements. We thought much could be gained by raising the subject of contentious politics, a broader network of contention. And we studied 15 cases of movements, strike waves, protest waves, nationalism, democratization, and revolution, all connected with state building, with a focus on the mechanisms and processes that linked contention and states. And this was what we called contentious politics. All of these wars and revolutions were linked to social movements. But where could we draw the line? McAdam and I, in our book, wanted to see war as a separate category from contention. Tilly disagreed, because he argued that war is the most extreme form of contention and that war is often related to social movements. He was right, and that is the theory that underlies this talk. Think of the following examples. The wars of the European Reformation were fought between religious movements. The French Revolution was a movement-based new state that fought simultaneous wars against foreign attackers and domestic counter-revolution. The nationalist movements in the Americas were fought against British, Spanish, and Portuguese imperialism and gave rise, among other things, to the Bolivarian movement. The United States Civil War was fought, at least in part, by an abolitionist movement and adopted its program of emancipation of the slaves. The fascist revolution in Italy grew directly out of a movement of veterans of World War I. And finally, the upsurge of contention in Argentina after the disastrous Malvinas War. All of these wars and revolution were related to major episodes of contentious politics. Yet scholars of international relations have seldom dealt with the broader relations between domestic contention and wars, and this is because most of them are not particularly interested in domestic politics. Vice versa, students of social movements have seldom paid attention to war making, because most of the movements they study, like student movements, working class movements, peasant movements, are not directly related to warfare. Think of the best book I know in English about war and state building in Latin America, Miguel Centeno's Blood and Debt. Although his book is in conversation with Tilly's work about taxation of wars, Centeno's work ignores the relationship between war and domestic contention in the 11 Latin American countries that he studied. In my forthcoming book, War, States, and Contention, to be published next year by Cornell University Press, I try to take up the challenge relating war to contentious politics. I show that war is often related to social movements in its advent, that movements often affect the conduct of wars and sometimes change its direction, like the Russian Revolution, and that wars often trigger the rise and conduct of new movements that affect the outcome of states. Sometimes these movements are progressive, like the democratization movement in Argentina after the Malvinas War. But sometimes movements take states in reactionary directions, such as the fascist revolution in Italy after the First World War. In the first half of my book, I analyzed 3 historical cases, which I won't be able to talk about today. Revolutionary France, the United States Civil War, and the growth of fascism out of World War I in Italy. The second half of the book focuses in an extended case study on the relations among war, state transformation, and contention in the United States in the wake of the bombings of September 11, 2001. I'm going to base what I say today only on this one case, although I would be happy to answer questions about other cases in the question and answer period. So there are 3 forms of contentious politics that followed the bombings of our September 11th. And these three forms were, first of all, the enormous outpouring of peace activism against the coming of the war in Iraq in 2003, which was a classical social movement. Second, the legal mobilization, what you in Latin America call juridification, of a coalition of lawyers and civil liberties groups against the illegal detention, torture, and surveillance that were brought on by these wars. This was a more contained form of contention that many students of social movements ignore at their peril. And finally, a radically new form of contention, digital activism, using the tools that infrastructural power have distributed to the American technology sector. And here I'll talk about the extraordinary events surrounding Edward Snowden's revelations about American spying. Let me begin with a definition. I want to distinguish the broad concept of contentious politics from the more familiar, narrower term social movements. The reason for this will become clearer in the second part of my talk when I turn to different forms of contention in the United States. Over the last decade, American and European scholars have begun to employ this concept of contentious politics. Coined by Tilly in a series of works he began in the 1970s on France and then on England, the use of the term has grown dramatically since the early 1990s. This graphic presents an analysis of the appearance of these two words in books in English between 1990 and 2008. From a magnitude approaching 0 in 1990, the term's use grew almost geometrically over this period of 18 years. Scholarly employment of the term has also grown rapidly. If we look at Google Scholar for 3-year periods starting in 1990, we find the total number of Google hits for the term rose from nearly 6,000 in 1990 to 92 to 24,000 in 2000 and 2002, falling slightly for the 2-year period 2012-2013. Now, why this increase in the use of the term that was almost completely unknown in 1990? One reason was its association with Tilly, with his distinguished reputation and its use by his students and collaborators. But probably more important was the expanding range of contention in the world beyond classical social movements, including civil wars, guerrilla insurgencies, clandestine conflict, suicide bombings, and the growing interest of scholars in these broader forms of contention. As these more lethal forms of contention spread around the world, scholars felt the need for a concept that goes beyond the traditional term social movements. So we arrive at a definition of contentious politics. Contentious politics is what happens when collective actors join forces in confrontation with elites, authorities, and opponents around their claims or the claims of those they claim to represent. One implication of this conceptual move is to limit the definition of social movements to what Manuel Antonio Garreton defines as types of collective actions that have relative stability over time and a certain degree of organization, oriented toward changes and the conservation of some sphere of social life. This is from Manuel Antonio's 2003 book. Another implication of this new definition is to analyze forms of collective action that escape the social movement framework. And a third implication is to force us to pay attention to one of the least understood subjects in the study of contentious politics, and that's the relationship between different forms of contention, both contained and transgressive. Many students are understandably interested in and excited by the more transgressive forms of contention. And what they often ignore is that these more dramatic forms of contention often have their results in periods of reform, like the period following 2011 in Chile. And this takes me to the relations between war and contentious politics. Some scholars, like my predecessor at Cornell, Clinton Rossiter, thought that war inevitably produces periods of constitutional dictatorship. Others, like the German legal theorist Carl Schmitt, reduced state sovereignty to the rule that sovereign is he who decides what the law is. And in his work on political theology, Schmitt argued that politics is a struggle between enemies. Schmitt applauded Weimar President Hindenburg's use of exceptional powers, which brought Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to power. He was writing about despotic power, and he was arguing that the state in wartime properly governs through despotic power. This gives us a time series of the reference to Carl Schmitt's work in the United States after 2001, actually before and after 2001, and you can see that there is a dramatic increase in references to Schmitt's work during the period of the 1990s and particularly after 2001. And this was not because Schmitt was particularly popular among American academics. On the contrary, Schmitt was referenced by American academics after 2001 because of their fear that the Bush administration's expansion of its power would produce a Schmittian despotic state caused by the problems of national security. Prominent among these scholars was my colleague at Princeton, Kim Shepley, who wrote a deeply pessimistic article subtitled "The International State of Emergency." In Shepley's model, the script of exceptional powers begins when war breaks out at the center of the state and follows 7 predictable stages that increasingly penetrate civil society with despotic powers. It begins with executive centralization, and this was clearly the intention of the Bush administration with its theory of the unitary executive. It follows with militarization, which we have seen as recently as August on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, when police came out with tanks and armored vehicles against African-American protesters. The model then proceeds to procedural shortcuts, ignoring the law or shifting the law to meet the government's purposes. It then leads to regimes of preventive detention and the banning of demonstrators, to the ending of speech protection, to the rise of secrecy and the reversal of transparency, and finally to anticipatory violence against those who disagree with the government's policies. A despotic state uses these instruments of power, like the police, the military, and the state of exception, to control its citizens when it goes to war. It follows that contentious politics would contract under such circumstances as the state becomes more centralized, more militarized, takes procedural shortcuts, uses preventive detention, and uses violence against its opponents. Now, there's good evidence that parts of what Shepley describes in her model occurred in the United States after September 11th, 2001. For example, Muslim immigrants in New York City were detained without evidence for months, and prisoners brought to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, were illegally detained and tortured after they were swept up on the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was certainly a centralization and partial militarization of the state. But there is very little evidence of the constriction of contentious politics. Why was this? I will argue that it was because in the United States, despotic power was balanced with a different type of power, infrastructural power. In his masterful 4-volume survey of world history, The Sources of Social Power, Michael Mann disaggregated the forms and logics of state power into 2 types: despotic power, the power of the elite over civil society, and infrastructural power, the legitimate power of the state to penetrate and to coordinate the activities of civil society through its own infrastructure. This distinction, in my view, is important in understanding how the United States, after 9/11, combined the instruments of despotic power with the use of infrastructural power. In contrast to Schmitt's concept of the sovereign as he who decides what the law is, infrastructural power makes it possible for the state to maintain and increase state power through its legitimacy by penetrating and centrally coordinating the activities of civil society through its own infrastructure. The instruments of infrastructural power go well beyond the repression of dissidents. They include financing the media, for example. Lance Bennett and his colleagues, in their work on communication, found that during the early years after 9/11, the media self-censored itself. Aided by the co-optation of the Democratic Party, which was in opposition, the media indexed the news to support the government's war-making policies. Infrastructural power also operates through the economy, through the expansion of military contracts, through which hundreds of thousands of workers and thousands of businesses came to depend on the war-making policies of the state. For example, in her recent book, The American Warfare State, Rebecca Thorpe shows how defense contracting expanded after 9/11 to economies in rural and semi-rural areas, in which it has become the predominant or the only form of employment. Here is Thorpe's map of the allocation of defense contracts to private firms in 1966. During the Vietnam War. Now here is a map of defense contracts after the first 5 years following 9/11. Through her innovative tracking of the budget outlays to local economies, Thorpe has revealed not only the connection between military budgets and congressional spending, she's demonstrated that this correlation has an effect on congressional and local voting. Small communities in which defense contracting has an economic monopoly invariably came to vote for the Bush administration and indirectly for its policies, and Republican and sometimes Democratic congressmen supported the expansion of the military budget because that military budget benefited their own communities. Infrastructural power as opposed to despotic power. But there's another side to the medal of infrastructural power. unlike despotic power, it legitimately permits and in fact encourages mobilization within civil society. This is why we see no effective decline in contentious politics in the United States during its wars of the early 21st century. Infrastructural power operates within an active and pluralistic civil society in which the clash of interests includes the forms of contentious politics that express opposition to the government's policies but do not threaten the hegemony of the state. In the next part of this talk, I'll describe three forms of contentious politics that operate freely within the American political system. And I'll also show how infrastructural power gives the state the flexibility and the resources to protect its war-making policies and practices. On February 15, 2003, millions of people around the world demonstrated against the impending invasion of Iraq. As Stefan Walgrave and Dieter Rucht showed in their book, The World Says No to War, 2,500,000 Americans joined these protests. Not only on the East and West Coast, where we find the usual suspects of American social movement activism, but even in the conservative heartland, Americans turned out in force to oppose the war that President Bush had already decided upon. Drawing on an analysis of public opinion polls carried out by my Cornell colleagues, we can see that by 2007, 3/4 of the American public was in favor of bringing the troops home from the war in Iraq. What's most remarkable from the standpoint of American power is that these protests were completely unrepressed. No one went to jail for opposing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a presidential candidate named Barack Obama largely won the 2008 presidential election on a platform of opposing the American wars. The anti-war movement was a classical social movement. It was made up of a coalition of new and existing peace groups organized through the familiar kinds of movement networks that the young people in this room experienced and have been studying in Chile since 2011. But if we were to stop with classical social movements, we would underestimate the scope and diversity of contentious politics and of the opposition to the Bush administration's wars. You here in Chile and my friends in Argentina have had plenty of evidence of a second form of contention, what we call legal mobilization and what legal scholars here have been calling juridification. It was brought about here by the struggle to reverse the amnesty that the military regimes gave themselves. What you may not realize is that there is a vital strand of legal mobilization in the United States as well that exploded in response to the war on terror and in particular to the illegal detention of suspects in Guantanamo Bay. When we look at how these wars affected contention, we can see a slow-growing wave of libertarian counteraction from a network of human rights lawyers, private law firms, civil society groups, and legally oriented social movement organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights and the American Civil Liberties Union. The first, in 2001, was a small civil rights organization in New York City that quickly took up the cause of defending the rights of detainees in Guantanamo. The second was the traditional defender of civil liberties who used a variety of tactics to defend the rights of both citizens and detainees using Freedom of Information Act petitions against the American government. These two groups had extraordinary growth both in activism and in resources during the decade following 2001. Now, both of them were attacked for a lack of loyalty by the super patriots of the Bush administration. But both of them gained enormous support, both from the legal profession and from the public at large in the decade that follows. These are summary statistics that I got from both groups. The growth of their staffs, of their financial support, and their membership. But even more important, the Center for Constitutional Rights, which had a radical reputation before 2011, attracted the cooperation of a network of bourgeois lawyers from big law firms in the United States, in Washington, to defend the legal cases that went to the courts. Those efforts bore fruit. In a series of Supreme Court decisions in the middle of the decade, when the court agreed that the government could not deprive detainees of all of their rights, and that the military commissions set up by the Bush administration were unconstitutional. These legal decisions set a clear limit on the tendency of the administration to exercise exceptional powers. Infrastructural power was working against despotic power. These decisions lacked the historical drama of the Pinochet decisions in Chile, or the decisions in favor of the disappeared in Argentina. But to those with a commitment to the rule of law, legal mobilization drew a line against the Bush administration's attempt to use exceptional powers. The successes of legal mobilization show that when we move beyond the traditional boundaries of social movements, we find forms of contentious politics that may be more effective than the more dramatic demonstrations in the streets that we generally study in the field of social movements. And this takes me to an even more dramatic form of contentious politics, but it was an individual form, not a social movement form. In 2013, a virtual tornado hit the American National Security Agency, the vast surveillance agency that the United States has developed around the world. A 29-year-old private contractor, Edward Snowden, downloaded a large number of classified government documents and gave them to a freelance journalist, Glenn Greenwald, and a documentary filmmaker, Laura Poitras, in a hotel in Hong Kong. Greenwald and Poitras turned the files over to The Guardian and to The Washington Post, and within a week, they revealed to the world the secrets that Snowden had uncovered. It turned out that the NSA had been gathering telephone traffic from around the world, invading citizens' privacy and forcing internet companies to share their records with the government. It also turned out that the agency's leadership had been lying to Congress in sworn testimony about what the agency was doing. Snowden's revelations were the most important release of government documents since the end of the Vietnam War. Nearly 18 months later, new documents continue to be made revealing the scope of the government's abuses of privacy. And Snowden, though he remained in semi-hiding in Moscow, remained very much in the public eye. There were three forms of spillover from the revelations Snowden made: international, domestic, and economic. Internationally, Snowden's revelations caused a crisis with some of the United States' closest allies, like Chancellor Merkel of Germany, who discovered the NSA had been hacking her personal cell phone, and President Rousseff of Brazil. Domestically, Snowden's revelations forced the president to create a commission to investigate the NSA's invasion of privacy, and led a conservative lawmaker, Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, to propose a new law that would rein in the agency. But perhaps the most important outcome within American civil society was at the level of the business elite. The big international internet companies like Google and Apple responded to Snowden's revelations by increasing the encryption of their clients' messages for fear that they would lose business to competitors in Europe that escaped the net of the NSA. And this struggle goes on today between the internet companies and the government, which claims that their actions are making it easier for terrorists to penetrate the American security state. But this was a major challenge to the security state because the state had been depending since 2001 on the cooperation of these companies to give it access to telephone and internet traffic at home and around the world. The Snowden story shows how far state surveillance has penetrated into people's privacy in the United States and elsewhere as the indirect result of the American wars of the early 21st century. It also shows how much more intrusive the American state has become since 9/11, despotic power. But it also shows how infrastructural power is a double-edged sword. It can diffuse resources within civil society. Snowden was among the thousands of Americans working for hundreds of private companies that since September 11th have been carrying out public functions. The story also shows how contentious politics is expanding beyond the organized movements that are familiar to movement scholars into more diffuse forms of contention, legal mobilization, digital activism. Snowden looks nothing like the kind of activist that we social movement scholars have studied since the 1960s. But his actions and those of his associates show that the new wars of the 21st century have produced both new threats to civil liberties, but also the invention of new forms of contention against them. But as I've said, infrastructural power is a double-edged sword. For just as it gives civil society groups and activists like Snowden the tools to oppose the excesses of the emergency state, it also gives the government the flexibility to use the law to defend its policies. In all three of the examples I've used, there was a blowback against opposition to the government's policies. Let's start with the most conventional social movement campaign, the 2003 movement against the war. As we saw, 2,500,000 Americans participated in these global protests. But when we look at who they were not long-haired radicals. They were engaged citizens. 51% of them had voted in the last national elections, 91% supported the Democratic Party, and 23% were active party identifiers. In contrast, you can look at the Italian figures in which you see that there was a much greater externality of the protesters against the Iraq War. Now, this is evidence of the great vitality of civil society in the United States. But ordinary politics did not give way to contention just because the country was at war. In the 2006 congressional elections, the Democratic Party profited from the growing anti-war settlement to take back control of Congress. And then, in 2008, Barack Obama campaigned for the presidency on an anti-war platform. The result of both elections was that the majority of peace movement activists left the peace movement and went back to their traditional party identification. and the movement against the war collapsed. Here is data that's collected by two political scientists, Michael Heaney and Fabio Rojas, who studied the level of participation in American peace demonstrations following 2001. And here's what they found: that after the Democrats took over Congress and Obama won the presidency, the level of participation in anti-war protests went down, even though the wars continued. They went down from between 10,000 and 100,000 participants per demonstration to between 1,000 and 10,000 after 2006. Infrastructural power allowed civil society to produce a massive anti-war movement, but the same civil society infrastructural power led to its decline as anti-war sentiment moved into mainstream politics. Legal mobilization followed the same combination of success and failure as the Bush administration fought back against the restrictions on its power that the Supreme Court imposed in the courses we looked at earlier. The court allowed the lower courts to define the content of its 4 key decisions, and those lower courts did so extremely narrowly. When a lower court approved the habeas petition of Mohammed al-Adahi, who was a suspect in Guantanamo, the Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia, something like a Corte de Apelaciones Federales, reversed the decision on the grounds that the lower court had held the government to too high a standard of evidence. Out of the 12 following cases of Guantanamo detainees that came to the Court of Appeals, 11 were reversed by that court. The same pattern we see in the military commissions that the Supreme Court had declared unconstitutional in 2008. In a law of the Obama administration in 2009, a new form of military commissions were created. Obama ended the abuse and torture of prisoners, but his government maintained the detention facilities around the world and refused to prosecute people against whom evidence was obtained by torture. This effectively meant life imprisonment without trial. The Snowden case is too recent and too dramatic for us to see yet what its long-term results will be. But 18 months after the publication of Snowden's findings, there are already moves to close the holes that he opened up in the government's surveillance policies. The Obama administration quickly labeled Snowden a traitor, revoked his passport, and sought to have him arrested and brought back to America. The FBI director opposed Apple and Google's decision to enable encryption of people's iPhones and Android devices and announced that he wants Congress to pass a law requiring all the tech companies to build backdoors into their systems so that the FBI can read people's emails if they give the company a court order. And finally, in Great Britain, the NSA's sister agency, the GCHQ, hit back even harder against the tech companies, accusing them of becoming terrorist networks of choice. The head of GCHQ said, "A new generation of freely available technology has helped groups like the Islamic State to hide from the security services and accused major tech firms of being in denial." So what can we conclude? In some ways, American security practices after 9/11 resembled Shepley's emergency script. Detainees brought to Guantanamo were essentially declared legal non-persons, reminding us of the practice of the French Revolution of putting suspects hors de la loi, outside the law. Despite the Supreme Court's rejection, Congress reinstated the military commissions. Immigrants were regarded by suspicion, and Muslim charities had their funds frozen. The NSA secretly tapped the telephone and internet traffic of millions of citizens. In some ways, America appeared to be sinking into a Schmittian state, in which sovereign is he who declares what the law is. But on the other hand, no state of siege was ever declared. There were no mass arrests of anti-war protesters. There were no expulsions or interning of population groups, no censorship of the press, and the Supreme Court on 4 occasions defended the rights of detainees. This was at least in part due to the efforts of human rights lawyers, civil society groups, and social movements operating within the legitimate structures of the infrastructural state. But these organizations were also limited by their legalistic strategies in a country in which, under cover of the rule of law, the government expanded its capacity to rule by law. Not lawlessly, but shifting the law to its policy purposes. Social movements depend upon determined activists' efforts, on citizen support, and especially on the power to innovate in the repertoire of contention, to contest government hegemony. This is why I find the Snowden affair so important, because it embodied 3 important challenges to the state, but also 3 important lessons for students of contentious politics. First, it shows how the nature of war has changed from the physical clash of massed armed forces to the systematic use of cyber power. Second, it shows how the American state at war does not depend only on the despotic power of its national security apparatus, but on the legitimated infrastructural power it holds within civil society. Third, and most important, it shows how contentious politics is evolving in the 21st century. Several of the students who will present their work in the next 2 days have been working on social media. From the fairly coherent, bureaucratic movement organizations we studied from the 1960s through the 1990s, there is a growing transition to more diffuse and more transnational networks of activists, journalists, documentary filmmakers, bloggers, newspapers, and ordinary citizens engaged in what Lance Bennett and his collaborators call the logic of connective action. Not only collective action, but connective action, putting the focus on the connection among activists through digital technology. We who study social movements often think that contention has failed when it ends after a public campaign, or when its activists enter politics, as has already occurred to some of the activists from the 2011 student movement in Chile. But in this age of digital communication, legal mobilization, and growing forms of contained contention, when a movement faces a state whose power is dispersed within civil society, the response must be to form networks made up of people who may not have met before, who may live in different cities or parts of the world, and whose lives are embedded in structures of civil society. Their successes may not emerge for years, and when they do emerge, they emerge through reform rather than contention. You saw such a slow, halting, and partial success in the legal campaign here and in Argentina to punish the criminals of the military regime that came to power in 1973. But this kind of success takes constant, patient, and innovative efforts, because modern states have infinite resources to bend back progress, as we've seen in the post-9/11 efforts to defend rights against the emergency state. Like Albert Camus, whose hero Sisyphus rolled a stone up the hill, only to find that it rolls down again, movements continue to seek new and innovative forms for their struggles. As Camus wrote during the resistance to the German occupation of France, struggling to the summit is enough to fill the human heart. We have to imagine that Sisyphus was happy. I'm not sure that the activists against the emergency state are happy, but their effectiveness depends on the reversible, changing, and innovative struggles of contentious politics. Thank you.
Una primera pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Cuáles son las diferencias que usted nota en la relación entre guerra y contienda política si comparamos experiencias históricas? En otras palabras, ¿qué distingue a la administración Bush de la administración de Johnson o Nixon? ¿En Guerra Fría no habrá poder infraestructural?
Can you hear me now? Thanks. I will try and answer all three questions with one answer in order to save time and to give more time for other people to ask questions. Infrastructural power is a structural concept. It is not a concept that operates only in one period of history and not in other periods of history. It changes very slowly, and it changes in response to the demands of contentious politics. Civil society in the United States has been strong since the beginning, and infrastructural power is, as I said, a double-edged sword. During some periods of history, it operates more effectively than in other periods of history. In a period of history such as the Cold War, the state used infrastructural power to create an atmosphere of repression and an atmosphere in which its activities were legitimated. The same is true during the period following 9/11, 2001. The difference between the Bush and the Johnson and Nixon administrations is that the Bush administration had to deal with a more active opposition because the war in Iraq had so little support from the very beginning. So the result was a powerful movement of civil society in the face of the government's increasingly illegal actions. The outcome was the election of Barack Obama in 2008, who has not proven to be capable of ending the wars because he has not controlled Congress.
Muchas gracias. Hay una pregunta sobre, la voy a leer en inglés, está escrita en inglés. When can the action of an individual, such as Snowden, be conceptualized as contentious politics, which has a collective action dimension?
So I don't know what the sense of the question is, but the distinction I'm trying to draw between social movements and contentious politics more generally is that contentious politics also includes forms of political activity that do not resemble social movements. Moreover, I would go one step further and say that if we examine the success, and I think it has been a success, of the Snowden revelations, that success was based on a social network. It was a network of journalists, bloggers, public intellectuals, and ordinary citizens who diffused the information that Snowden provided almost instantaneously across the country. And this was in contrast with previous revelations such as the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War. The Pentagon Papers were probably equally damning of the government's behavior, but the importance of the Pentagon Papers was limited by the limitations of public communication. And here we see an extraordinary operation of social media in the United States and around the world. That was responsible for the diffusion of Snowden's revelations and for the power it had to challenge the American government.
Una pregunta sobre estas nuevas formas de movilización que usted señala, legal mobilization and digital mobilization. ¿Pueden estas nuevas formas de movilización desfavorecer o terminar por desincentivar las formas más tradicionales de movilización? ¿Pueden estas nuevas formas de movilización desfavorecer o terminar por desincentivar las formas más tradicionales de movilización?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. And for many years after the invention of the internet, I was very skeptical about the impact of these new forms of communication because I worried that people would think that they were acting effectively as activists because they were passing messages through email or through the internet to other activists, and that this would substitute for what scholars now call online or offline activism. I've become more of a believer in the role of social media in the diffusion and the mobilization of opinion, but I've also remained enough of a skeptic to believe that new forms of communication can be used by many different kinds of social actors and by many different governmental actors. One of my colleagues studies the use of social media in China, and it's quite striking that social media is emerging as a very effective tool of the government in repressing dissent. So before we become enthusiasts believing that social media are revolutionizing everything, we must take a note of caution and understand that this form of communication, like all forms of communication, can be used by many actors for many purposes.
Una pregunta en inglés. Is there a relation between ideology and infrastructural power? If so, which is it?
The answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is I have no idea. More seriously, I believe that infrastructural power uses ideology, but it is not the same as ideology. Think of the second example I gave of infrastructural power in the United States after 9/11, the expansion of military contracts to many parts of the country in which citizens came to depend upon the economic benefits, and in which members of Congress voted on behalf of the maintenance of war budgets because it helped their citizens. That has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with material benefits. And that's one of the most effective ways in which the government uses infrastructural power.
Hay un par de preguntas sobre el papel y la legitimidad y legitimación de las élites. Una de ellas tiene que ver con entender que si la política de contención y los movimientos sociales en su mayoría son contrahegemónicas, por lo tanto, si las respuestas son reformas que le dan mayor legitimidad a las élites sociales, ¿cómo podríamos entonces medir su éxito?
That's an excellent question, and it's one which a complete answer would require probably a lecture in itself, if not an entire course. I have never been one of the social scientists who believes that the economic elite is unified and that it controls the state. I've always believed that there is a mutual symbiotic relationship between the state and elites, but I've also believed that elites, under most circumstances, are divided, have different economic interests, and therefore have different political programs. My sense is that the interesting fact about the Snowden revelations was that it divided the economic elite in the United States in a very fundamental way between those who supported the government and those who came to oppose the government for economic reasons. And this is the unusual aspect of infrastructural power. It can bring together elements of the elite with elements of the non-elite, and it can also divide parts of the elite from other parts of the elite.
Aquí hay dos preguntas que yo diría que están relacionadas, pero le voy a pedir a una de las personas que lo escribe que le reconozco la letra, que es Vicente, si la puedes leer tú porque me cuesta leerla. ¿Puedes leerla? Conozco tu letra, pero todavía no la puedo interpretar.
I wonder if some of the forms of contention that you described should be treated as part of the repertoire of a new type of social movement gaining momentum. For instance, in the Snowden case that we have recently showed, I doubt that that would be an individual, or considered only an individual type of action, because you can harken back its action to the free software movement of the 70s and the 80s, and also to the cyberpunk network that supports WikiLeaks, for instance. So that's an action that makes sense in the development of a new type of social movement, I guess.
Okay.
Another question on that. Is the context, in the context of Snowden revelation, I would like to hear from you more about Julian Assange.
More about?
Julian Assange, Assange's case.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. I am a Garretoniano in the sense that I agree very much with Manuel Antonio's definition of social movements as an enduring relationship between challenging groups and the state or elites when those challenging groups represent a consistent claim for social or political change. That's one form and one degree of contentious politics. We will only know if the Snowden events will produce a social movement in the fullness of time. It's too soon to say. And this leads to a more general comment, perhaps one that many of our students will not agree with. And that is that when there is a dramatic and transgressive episode of contention, like the 2011 student protests in Chile, we will only know if it's going to lead to an enduring social movement with time. It may lead to excellent benefits, like the reforms that are currently under discussion by the current government. But that does not mean that it will lead to an enduring social movement. On the contrary, when we think of the student movements in France and Italy in the 1960s, both of the movements in those countries, the movements of 1968, led to educational reforms, but they also led to the dissolution and the internal conflict of the student movement. So it may be that reform leads to failure in the formation of an enduring social movement, even though reform may lead to success in the realization of the goals of the social movement. There was another question about Assange. So I think it's very difficult to understand the dramatic success of Snowden without understanding the Assange episode that preceded it. Assange is not as attractive an individual as Snowden was, but Assange laid the groundwork for Snowden by producing a political opportunity structure in which Snowden took action and in which his actions were perceived and understood by a large part of the public.
Muy bien, estamos llegando ya hacia el final de este periodo de preguntas y discusión y quisiera pedirle al profesor Tarrow si es que podríamos aprovechar de hacer también una revisión un poco hacia atrás en su trayectoria, que hay una pregunta que lo invita un poco a reflexionar en términos de otros conceptos con los que usted ha trabajado. La pregunta es, ¿de qué modo se relaciona la contienda política, contentious politics, con conceptos trabajados anteriormente como la estructura de oportunidades políticas? ¿Cumplen las oportunidades políticas un rol similar para la contienda política que para los movimientos sociales tradicionales?
I'm not sure that everyone here is or should be familiar with my previous concepts. And it would be difficult to give a thorough answer without outlining what these previous concepts are. But I think it would be helpful if I gave a general overview of how my work has changed over the past actually 50 years. I already exposed myself when I talked about the agrarian reform in Chile. I believe that I started out my career, like many of us in the 1960s, as a quasi-Marxist. A quasi-Marxist because I was never a Marxist politically, but because I was beginning with a structuralist epistemology. I believed, like many people of my generation, that we could look at macrostructural variables such as class conflict and derive from those variables the nature and the extent of contentious politics. In the course of my career, I became more skeptical that such macrostructural approaches could effectively explain the outbreak or the variations in contentious politics. All we need to do is look at countries which have very similar macrostructural profiles, but very different profiles of contentious politics. and we will understand that there is an intervening space between structural variables and the variables of contentious politics. And my efforts over the past 20 years or so have been to try and work within that intermediate space by developing theories that describe the mechanisms and processes in the polity as a whole, rather than focusing either on the macrostructural determinants of contention or on the microstructural behaviors of contentious actors. I wish I could give a more detailed answer. As you know, we social scientists like to talk about ourselves a lot, but you didn't come here to hear me give an intellectual biography. If I had to summarize the changes in my own approach, it would be to say that I am a student of the political process of contention who is recovering from having been a structuralist.
Muchas gracias, profesor Tarrow, por su paciencia con todas las preguntas que habían de la audiencia y muchas gracias a cada uno por participar con sus preguntas. A continuación, entonces, vamos a